Hey, Hamilton came out on Disney Plus last week and I've got to talk about it. No, for real, I don't have a choice. I haven't made a Hamilton video yet, and this morning I got an email from YouTube asking if I had died. It's a hot topic of discussion at the moment, is what I'm saying. The show has been a cultural phenomenon for years, thanks to its success on Broadway and in various touring productions, but now that the filmed version featuring the original cast has been released and most of us have been able to actually watch it for the first time, it seems like everybody's got a take on Hamilton. And, of course, everybody includes me, so here's my Hamil take. Not the reference I was making, though obviously I think he's delightful. He's Luke Skywalker, for Christ's sake. How am I not gonna love him? And come on, that story he tells about being on the plane with Carrie Fisher and Harrison Ford right after Star Wars first opened, and he sees the crowd of fans waiting for them at the airport, and he turns to them and says, "Guys, I think there's somebody famous on this plane." Adorable. Anyway, like most people who have become Hamilton fans, I discovered the show through the original soundtrack. I've never gotten to see it on stage, so until I watched the Disney Plus version last week, I had never seen Hamilton at all, only listened to it. But like most people who have become Hamilton fans, I listened to it repeatedly, incessantly for years until I could sing along to every track without missing a beat or flubbing a syllable. That's unusual for me, at least when it comes to musicals. There are lots of albums I've gotten to know that well. Shit, I could probably still sing along to most of the Verve Pipe's discography without butchering the lyrics too badly. I was a teenager in the 90s, okay? Who are you to judge me? But Hamilton is the only soundtrack of a musical I've ever memorized. I don't really dig musicals, as a rule. As a cynical, know-it-all, Verve Pipe-loving teen, I hated musicals. I'd like to think I'm a lot less uptight and close-minded now, but even today, as an earnest, self-effacing, Verve Pipe-loving person of early pre-middle age, musical theater is far from my favorite art form. In fact, other than Hamilton, I don't really even like any other Broadway musicals, let alone love them with an obsessive, all-consuming passion. Before I go any further, I want to acknowledge that while my own assessment of it is overwhelmingly positive, not everybody agrees. Since the film of Hamilton was released on Disney Plus, more critical voices have spoken out to share their concerns about how the racially diverse casting distracts from the ways in which the story whitewashes the actual history that inspired it. Critiques of Hamilton for being ahistorical, for glorifying slaveholders, for neglecting opportunities to include characters based on actual people of color who lived during the depicted events, and for all the other ways in which it is problematic are fair and valid, and I'm not here to argue against them. People can hate the show because of those problems. People who love the show can and should acknowledge those problems. Being critical is an important part of engaging with art and need not and should not prevent us from loving art and allowing it to entertain us, challenge us, move us, and enrich our lives. My task as a critic is to try and articulate to the best of my ability what I think and feel about the art I engage with. Many people may think and feel differently for many different reasons, but I happen to love Hamilton. What is it about Hamilton that makes me love it so much? Is it because it's so popular and my tastes are so bland and suggestible that I'll latch on to anything my culture tells me I'm supposed to like? Well, yeah. I mean, no, no, of course not. Come on, if that were true, don't you think I'd have seen at least one episode of This Is Us? But I think Hamilton's cultural prominence did play a role because it was talked about so much its first year on Broadway, because it won the Pulitzer, because it was tagged as being not merely good but important. I was a lot more curious about it than I would have been about another hot musical that all the theater nerds were excited about. It's kind of funny when I think about it, the importance of Hamilton, its relevance as a cultural object, opened the door for me, but that's not what actually made me fall in love with the show. If I recall correctly, the sequence of events went something like this. In 2016, I watched the clip of the cast performing at the Grammys and went, huh, interesting. A few months later, I watched the cast performing at the Tonys and went, oh, okay. I noticed the original soundtrack was streaming, so I pushed play on that, and 2.5 hours later, I was crying. I fell in love with Hamilton because it broke my heart. Yes, the songs are catchy and clever and fun to sing along with. Yes, the very intentional racial diversity in the casting enabled a story inspired by the lives of wealthy white people, many of whom were slave owners, to be about so much more, in my opinion anyway. And yes, the performers are likable, charismatic, and preposterously talented. But if all those things and other aspects of the show I didn't mention just now didn't combine to make me feel something, I doubt I'd have found Hamilton worth standing here talking about. Breaking my heart is a surefire way for a story to wind up high on my favorite list. My favorite novel, The Great Gatsby, has all sorts of things going for it. Fitzgerald's gorgeous prose, its critiques of the excesses of the Jazz Age and the American myth of upward mobility. But the reason it's my favorite is because Gatsby's tragic, doomed attempt to recapture his past hits me right where I live. It makes me feel something. When I reflect on some of my favorite films, many, not all, certainly, but many, share themes of tragedy, loss, grief, longing, characters forced to confront no-win situations, characters struggling and often failing to atone for past sins or live with regrets. City Lights, Ikiru, All Quiet on the Western Front, Casablanca, Sunset Boulevard, Out of the Past. The list goes on and on and on. Hamilton is like those. It hits me the same way in the same places. It lingers. It stirs up my own regrets, my own mistakes. When Angelica sings about romanticizing what might have been, I feel like I know exactly what she's talking about. When Burr pulls the trigger, knows immediately it was the wrong thing to do, but also knows there's no way to change it, knows that he'll have to live with that choice for the rest of his life. I think I know how that feels too. My own experiences aren't nearly so epic or so consequential. I doubt they're of much interest to anyone but me, but that's not the point. Hamilton compels me to make those connections, to tie myself to its characters through these things we share, because that's what great art does. That's why it resonates. And now that I've seen Hamilton on Disney+, I can tell you that watching it resonates in the same places as listening to it. There are some interesting differences, which I'll get to in a minute, but the emotional experiences of watching the show and listening to the soundtrack are very much the same. I get choked up during the same songs: Satisfied, Burn, It's Quiet Uptown, Who Lives, Who Dies, Who Tells Your Story. I relate to the same characters: Angelica, Burr. I admire George Washington just the same. I get the same kick out of seeing Thomas Jefferson cast as the flamboyant villain. It's a great show to see and to hear. But obviously, now that I've actually gotten to see it, I realize how much I've been missing just listening to the soundtrack. I thought Jonathan Groff was great as King George already, but after watching his performance, god damn, that guy's a genius, right? He barely even moves for most of his first number, and the way he fires off those da-da-da-da-das like bullets from a semi-automatic firearm that hadn't even been invented yet, God, how fantastic is that dude? And there's also Renee Elise Goldsberry's facial expressions and body language as she tries to evade Burr in The Schuyler Sisters and gazes regretfully across the stage at Alexander and Eliza in Satisfied, and Christopher Jackson's commanding stage presence as Washington, the loose yet perfectly timed interplay between Lin-Manuel Miranda, Anthony Ramos, Daveed Diggs, and Okiriete Onalduwan in their scenes together as Hamilton, John Lawrence, Lafayette, and Hercules Mulligan. The layers upon layers of choreography that carry so much meaning and add such depth to the story, and the moments of exquisite simplicity and stillness, like Leslie Odom Jr. as Burr, standing alone, commanding the stage as he sings Wait For It. I want to go back to that loose interplay between Hamilton and his buddies in Act 1, because that's something that is present throughout the show. There's a looseness, a relaxed confidence, a naturalism to all the performances in the Disney Plus film that I didn't expect, having only previously listened to the soundtrack. It's not that the performances on the soundtrack are stiff, but they're very precise and more theatrical than those in the film. Some of that is due, no doubt, to the differences in format and the processes involved in creating the soundtrack as opposed to the film. The soundtrack was recorded in a booth, in a studio, with the lyrics on a rack in front of the performers, whereas the film is a recording of an actual on-stage performance of the show in the theater, in front of an audience, with everyone in costume and in the moment. Plus, since the soundtrack is audio only, there are certain beats that are hit a bit stronger to ensure that they come across to the listener, and that has an effect on performance as well. But there are other differences between the soundtrack and the film that I don't think are due, or at least not entirely due, to those factors. There are differences that I think are the result of the natural evolution of the performances and of the relationships of the actors to their characters and the story. The original soundtrack was recorded in August 2015. The film was shot 10 months later in June 2016. It's fascinating to see how the performances changed and deepened, sometimes in very subtle ways, during that 10-month interval. I'll give you one example. In the show's second song, Aaron Burr, Sir, there's a funny bit near the beginning where Miranda as Hamilton tells Burr, who he's just met for the first time, that he punched the bursar at Princeton. He then goes on to explain why, and on the original soundtrack, it goes something like this. I wanted to do what you did, graduate into and join the revolution. He looked at me like I was stupid. I'm not stupid. In the film, he performs the exact same line, but more like this. He looked at me like I was stupid. I'm not stupid. I'm no Lin-Manuel Miranda, but hopefully you get the idea. And if you listen to the soundtrack and watch the film, you'll be able to see the difference even more clearly than through my amateur demonstration. The first time on the soundtrack, Miranda reads the line a little cocky, a little pushy, and also a little bit jokey. But in the film, his delivery is very different. He's more earnest, more vulnerable, almost pleading to be acknowledged and validated, but also fiercely determined to prove himself. That combination of vulnerability and determination is a defining quality of Miranda's portrayal of Hamilton in the film. It's not that it isn't there on the soundtrack, it definitely is, and is at the core of the character as written, but in the film, we can see how it has come to the forefront of the performance. You can also see the difference when you compare the soundtrack and the film versions of Hamilton's first meeting with Washington. On the soundtrack, Miranda plays him as awestruck, eager to please. In the film, he's clipped, composed, with a little bit of a chip on his shoulder. Because he's the lead character and because he's such an emotionally open performer, the changes in Miranda's performance as Hamilton are the easiest to spot, but there are interesting alterations in the performances of the other leads as well. In the film, Leslie Odom Jr. throws himself into Burr's scenes of campaigning and self-promotion with an unselfconscious relish that doesn't always come across on the soundtrack. And Philippa Sue brings more strength and shrewdness to Eliza to balance out the warmth and generosity of spirit that define her on the soundtrack. One of the unique charms of live theater is that each performance of a show is unique and usually ephemeral. Hamilton doesn't change on the page, or at least it hasn't significantly since it opened on Broadway, but every time the cast takes the stage, they create the show anew, and that show, that night, belongs to that audience alone. Because I'm more of a movie person, I tend to think of acting in the singular. F. Murray Abraham played Salieri in Amadeus. Viola Davis played Mrs. Miller in Doubt. Those performances were captured in those films, and now they are finished and locked and will exist forever in that form. But on stage, Salieri, Mrs. Miller, and every other character in every other show has been played many times, and in the more successful shows by many different actors. And each performance is something new. The playing of the character isn't a one-time thing, it's a continuous process, an ongoing act that is repeated and refined night after night. Theater people know this already. Now, thanks to the Hamilton film on Disney Plus and the original soundtrack, which we can compare it to, people like me, who haven't been super into theater, can also get a sense of how, when you're on stage, every action really is an act of creation. The soundtrack and the film are both Hamilton, just as every single unique performance on stages around the world over the last 5 years has been. Hamilton isn't one thing because it isn't a static object. It's an act. It's a work. Like all truly great works of art, it's something to be created and recreated, reinterpreted and reevaluated, experienced and re-experienced. Always familiar, always brand new. Pretty sure Satisfied is going to wreck me every time, though.